And now I thought we'd better call Saul Eslake, that is, independent economist. Well, Saul, are there any surprises in this morning's CPI?
Well, the figure was a tad higher than the market consensus, which was for 0.6% in the quarter. We instead got 0.8, which pushed the annual headline inflation rate up to 3.8%. But closer inspection tells us that 70% of that increase in the June quarter came from four components that together account for just 13% of the basket of goods and services that the CPI represents. So petrol, fruit and vegetables, hospital and medical services, and the unwinding of temporary discounts on electricity prices in Western Australia were what accounted for the numbers being higher than had been expected. And the Reserve Bank's preferred measure of underlying inflation only rose 0.5% in the quarter, giving you an annual rate of 1.6%. That's the highest rate since the first quarter of last year, but
still under their preferred target of 2%.
That's right, and for the 22nd quarter in a row. In other words, we've had 5.5 years of the underlying inflation rate being below the bottom end of the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% target band. There's nothing on the immediate horizon that suggests that we're going to get back to at least 2% in the next couple of quarters. So I think the Reserve Bank is going to interpret this result as reinforcing its judgment that although what they call the real economy, real GDP and employment have been growing more quickly than they or anyone else had expected, what they call the nominal economy, which is prices and wages, haven't grown any faster than they had expected at all. And with the real economy likely to be taking a knock now in the September quarter, with a very strong likelihood that real GDP will have gone backwards in this quarter. The Reserve Bank's certainly not going to interpret today's numbers as suggesting that it ought to be bringing forward its plans to raise interest rates for the first time.
Right. Okay. So as we were, really.
Well, yes. And, the Reserve Bank had been saying for some time, and financial markets had known, that the Q2 number was going to be an outlier to the upside, just as we knew this time last year that the minus 1.9% that we had in the June quarter itself, which gave us a negative annual headline inflation rate as well, was also going to be an outlier that had no implications for monetary policy whatsoever.
So just moving on to perhaps talk about the post-pandemic economy. I don't know if it's too early to talk about that or not, but it's sort of perhaps we can, because I read a note of yours in which you said that Australia's post-pandemic economy is influenced to a large extent by the choice, the decision not to go for fast and complete vaccination like other countries did.
Well, that's right.
And I'm just interested in the fact that you called it a choice, because it seems to have been an accident.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. Australia and New Zealand have done very well by comparison with other countries over the past 12 to 15 months. We are, along with Korea and Taiwan, the only advanced economies where the level of GDP has recovered to above its pre-pandemic high, where, as far as I know, the only economies where the level of employment is above its pre-pandemic peak. And in Australia's case, we're one of very few where the unemployment rate is lower than it was before the pandemic struck. So that's all.
Well done us.
Exactly. Well done us. And well done us for two reasons. One, because during a period when the only realistic strategy, in circumstances where initially we didn't know what the virus was capable of doing to people, and we didn't know how long it would take to develop a safe and effective vaccine, the only effective strategy to minimize the damage to the economy was to suppress the virus. And we did that very effectively, partly because, to their credit, our governments acted on the advice of health professionals which might seem the obvious thing to do, but the US and the UK in particular didn't do it. And our people, for the most part, complied with what they were asked to do and not to do. But it was also a lot easier for Australia and New Zealand to pursue that strategy simply because we are islands so far away from anywhere else. And if you look around the world, almost all the other countries that have been as successful as Australia and New Zealand at suppressing the virus have also been islands. That's not to say that every island was successful, because in the case of the UK, they chose not to follow the health advice that we did. And in any case, the stretches of water that make them an island are a lot shorter than the stretches of water between Australia and New Zealand and virtually everywhere else in the world. And that has made it easier for us to suppress the virus than countries which share land borders with their neighbours. The other thing that helped us, of course, was that Australia and New Zealand did more by way of providing fiscal policy support to households and businesses through the pandemic than almost any other advanced economy in the world, with the exception of the United States, where throwing a lot of cash around didn't help them very much because they'd been so incompetent in suppressing the virus. But since around the turn of the year, another strategy has been available, one with virtually no economic cost compared with repeated or persistent lockdowns, and that has been to vaccinate as much of your population as possible as quickly as you possibly can. And I say that Australia chose not to pursue that strategy. It wasn't an accident. The Australian government put most of its eggs in the AstraZeneca basket, partly because AstraZeneca was cheaper than the mRNA alternatives, Pfizer and Moderna, but importantly also because of their obsession with what they like to call sovereignty. That is, the idea that AstraZeneca, unlike the mRNA viruses, could be made at home here in Australia. And they were the reasons why they chose the AstraZeneca virus rather than Pfizer and Moderna. And as things have happened, initially the EU blocked shipments of AstraZeneca early on in the piece, which was certainly an unfriendly gesture on their part, but it was also slower to get up the manufacturing of AstraZeneca here in Australia. And of course, the miscommunication by the medical advisors and the government itself around the risks associated with AstraZeneca played into what was a degree of complacency among the Australian population about the necessity of being vaccinated, and to what's a surprisingly high level of vaccine hesitancy among the Australian population, which the government has chosen not to do very much about by way of, for example, running campaigns that they're keen to do in other areas. So I think the fact that, unlike Canada, the country which in most respects is more like Australia than any other country in the world, which, like Australia, can't manufacture mRNA vaccines, but put more emphasis on getting as many jabs into as many arms as quickly as possible, such that now 70% of the Canadian population has had at least one jab and more than 50% are fully vaccinated. They, like other countries, are able to make choices about how to respond to the spread of the Delta variant that we in Australia are simply not able to make, and won't, it would seem, be able to make until perhaps as late as the beginning of next year. That's the result of choices that our government has made, and the likely consequence of those choices is that this time next year, when we may be looking at the results of the next federal election, Australia's economic performance will probably not appear as good as that of other countries that made different choices about their vaccination strategies.
Yes. Well, there you are. Not much we can do about it now. It's too late, right? It's done.
But it is, but I think we ought to be conscious of why we are in the position that we're in.
Yep. Thanks very much, Saul.
That's a pleasure, Alan.